mic back on. All right. So in the remaining hour, is that right? Yeah, 45 minutes. We're going to talk all about invasive species. So I'm going to rush through this, and we're going to get to parts of it, and we'll see how it goes. But let's talk a little bit more about what invasive species are. So defining invasive species, we talked about the challenge in this, right? Non-native to the ecosystem under consideration. So how you define that is part of that definition. And this is their exact definition, so it's kind of wordy, but whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And that we care about. You know, this is something that we subjectively decide. So this is one of the prettiest invasive plants that I know of. This is purple loosestrife. It is in Kentucky, although I don't know how much of it you have in this area. Do you?
Well, it pushes to water to get a lot more.
Yeah, it likes wetlands.
You can see from I-64 and a ditch line kind of in Shelby County. I haven't noticed it.
People love it because it's very purple and beautiful when it's flowering, but it will form very dense monocultures of just that species. So just because it is pretty and just because people like it does not mean that it is not invasive. So from a biological perspective, people use the term invasive to talk about the ability of something to invade a new area, to colonize. But that is different from the federal definition of invasive species. That tends to have more to do with it rapidly colonizing, but is different from when we talk about invasives. So that's when some of the terminology is going to get complicated. So when we talk about native, native is always dependent on your geographic qualifier. So everything is native somewhere. We just may not know where that is in the case of some organisms. But just because something is non-native here does not mean it isn't native somewhere else. And we call things native if they have developed for hundreds, thousands of years to a particular region or ecosystem. Of course, even that is subjective because at some point everything was also not native. So everything arrived to some new area and colonized that area, but it might have been thousands of years ago. So that's tricky.
Ginkgo?
Ginkgo, for example.
It's not, it is not
native.
I wouldn't consider it invasive.
No, yeah. So then you've got your non-natives. They are introduced. They could be with human help intentionally or accidentally to a new place, a new type of habitat where it was not previously found. But like ginkgo. So you wouldn't call ginkgo invasive. You would call it non-native. It is not native to this North American environment as we currently know it.
Long enough to become another 100 years or more.
Or you might say, when people talk about something that is non-native, but for ginkgo, you don't see a lot of ginkgo growing in the forest, naturally reproducing. Ginkgo is a very landscape tree. But if, let's say it were non-native and it did naturally reproduce and you could find it, but it wasn't, it wasn't growing in dense stands, it wasn't really hurting other native species that we know of. People tend to refer to that as naturalized. Of course, something that's naturalized at one point, there can be a latent period and then all of a sudden we realize, wow, that thing that we thought wasn't really doing that much damage is taking over. And a lot of invasive plants will kind of have this period where it looks like they're not too dominant and then they take over. Dan, did you have something to comment?
I mean, they find their balance.
Well, in some cases they find their balance. So another thing that could happen is that maybe in a few hundred years from now, the things that we currently call invasive will no longer be considered invasive, or at least they won't be as dominant as they currently are because they will acquire insects and pathogens and other things to keep them in control. So over many, many years, things will probably find their balance.
It's an interesting story of one particular tree, Osage orange. It's not from around this part of the country, so one part of Texas and Oklahoma is where it's originally from. They took it and used it as cattle barriers. And so they planted it everywhere, and now you see it in many places. So that is an exotic because it's not from this part of the country, but now it's what it is.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's, I think, a good reminder to all of us that these definitions are not set in stone and that things can change a little bit. The other thing I wanted to point out is that I frequently hear about red cedar or being invasive. How many of you consider it invasive? Do any of you consider it invasive? No, okay. Well, we have a special group in here. But a lot of people will say, oh, this is such an invasive species. And what they mean is that this is an early colonizer. If you have an old field that you no longer mow, this will be one of the first things to come in. It is a native species, though. It does not have a lot of the other things that we associate with invasives, but people don't like it sometimes. So they call it an invasive because it will take over. And you can see it growing in pretty dense stands, especially if it's an area that just is kind of coming back from being mowed. So it is. It's in the juniper family. People call it red cedar. It is not a true cedar, yeah. Similar, we talked about honeybees, non-native, not considered invasive because their net impact is thought to be positive, not negative. So we like them, we introduce them. People try to cultivate them. Same with a lot of our agricultural crops and species. So another way to look at invasion is as a process. So we're talking about invasive species. You can also think of the process of invasion. And it has several different phases. So one thing I like to remind people is we talked about non-natives, and that all of the stars have to align for a species to become invasive in some ways. So we know the ones that we don't like and we want to get rid of them. So we kind of, sometimes all you see is invasive species. But if you think about it as a process, there's a lot of different steps that everything has to work out just right for something to become invasive. So first off, you've got species in their native range. Who knows where? So if something's growing in China, it's not going to get here. There are major geographical barriers to prevent it from getting here naturally, right? So right there, that's kind of a barrier that has to be overcome. So let's say it's transported to a new range. So someone accidentally or intentionally brings it here. What are the chances that the environment here is good for it? You know, things tend to match where they're growing. If you bring something to a new location, more often than not, you expect it to not do well. You expect plants to be adapted to their local environments. So chances are it won't do great. It might even die. It might not be adapted for this environment. So, okay, let's say the abiotic conditions, the weather, the climate, the soil, everything is right for it. And so it survives. It's got to survive and grow in this new range, not just kind of exist, but it's got to thrive. The population has to grow. And for all of that, it's got to have the right biotic conditions, its kind of interaction with other species there, the other plants, the other insects, the other microbes in the soil have to be right. And then for it to be invasive, it's got to basically explode in population. So not only is it getting there, it's surviving, it's thriving, its population is growing across the landscape and spreading. So there's a lot of steps that need to happen for something to be invasive. So while it's easy to be upset and angry and frustrated by the non-native invasive species that we see, I think it's worthwhile remembering that they're really a small percentage of the overall non-native species that are out there. And so in addition to all of these things, it's got to have a negative impact on the ecosystems, on us, on the environment. So more often than not, these things are not going to all come in a line. But as we can see, they do frequently, and we live with those consequences in the form of invasive species. Any questions on that? All right, so what are the characteristics of invasive species? This is tricky because it's really hard to predict what species become invasive. There are plenty of species that don't do these things and are still invasive and problematic, but in general. So Dan, you were mentioning this earlier. What is this, for those who don't know?
Autumn olive.
Autumn olive. And look at these delicious juicy berries here. So you were saying they were delicious, and people harvest them. They make jams and jellies out of them. But they also illustrate a point. So a lot of invasives tend to have really high reproduction. They are prolific seed producers, or maybe they spread really rapidly through roots, through rhizomes. They disperse rapidly, so birds will eat these seeds and spread them far. They grow really rapidly, so they might be our early colonizers, the things that would be the first to crowd out and shade out other species. They can tolerate a really wide range of habitats, food sources, and that gets back to where we're talking about invasion as a process. If they could not tolerate a wide range of habitats, what are the odds that they would get to this new location and find the exact perfect habitat for them? So a lot of these invasives have a big range that they can tolerate. Few natural predators. So one of the kind of driving hypotheses for why invasive species are so successful is that they leave their enemies behind, and they come to this new place and they have no insects and diseases that keep them in check. So that's one benefit they might have over native competitors that have to deal with all of those as well. And then some of them, as we discussed out in the field, are allelopathic. They can change the soil, emit chemicals that hurt other competitors. They can do other things to change the environment to their benefit. So those are some of the common characteristics of invasive species that allow them to be so successful. Allelopathic, yeah. Allelopathic plants, and they don't necessarily have to be non-native or invasive. So another good example would be walnut, right? Anyone have a walnut tree? If you have one in your yard, you know that nothing is going to grow underneath it. And that's because that tree is emitting chemicals that even in natural setting with no invasives, plants are in competition with each other. They have communication with each other, trees do, but they also compete with each other. And so some plants emit these chemicals that they kind of like an ongoing battle between different plants to buy themselves resources. So many invasive plant species are known to do this, allelopathic. So why do we care? Well, we saw, and we already talked about this a little bit, so I'm just going to run through it, but ecological and economic impacts, these can be direct or indirect. And there might be the fact that this organism is killing trees, but it might also be the fact that once you get this organism, there's a quarantine that totally changes everything about the economy of that species or something like that. So with plant pathogens, that's happened with the nursery trade many times. Decreased biodiversity. This is, I think, the main issue why a lot of us care about these invasive species is that we want to have thriving native communities. That doesn't mean they're not going to have non-native organisms. That just means we want the native species to also be thriving. Changing ecosystems, and in some cases, these are going to be taking advantage of changes. These could be changes in the climate. These could be kind of invasional meltdowns, as they're called. So you get one invasive species in, and it drives the success of other invasive species. So for example, emerald ash borer and bush honeysuckle. Those two are a recipe for success because you have the emerald ash borer comes in and takes out the canopy. Then you have bush honeysuckle in the understory that takes off. So two invasive species or more that are kind of benefiting from each other. Yeah.
Seeing that garlic mustard.
Yeah.
Kind of near my house, there's this church, and it's at the base of this hill. And 3 years ago or so, the garlic mustard was like a total mass. And then I realized the last couple of years, I'll look over there, and I don't see any.
So garlic mustard is a kind of exciting one in preliminaries. I mean, so populations can fluctuate, and maybe next year you'll see tons of it. But people have also looked at garlic mustard and think that, and I don't know, I think the jury's still out on this, but think that the longer it's established in a site, the poorer it performs. So garlic mustard is thought to be allelopathic. It might not initially have soil microbes that keep it in check. but that after a long, like many years, decades, it does worse and worse in that soil. And that's kind of what you'd expect if you had the lack of enemies of these invasive species playing a major role in their success. So if the reason why garlic mustard is so successful is because it doesn't have those, you would expect that the longer it's in a site, the worse it would do. Of course, I mean, that's what we want for all of these invasive species, and sometimes that's not realized. But there has been some good preliminary work that I've seen with garlic mustard that suggests that it is, the longer it's in an area, the worse it does. So hopefully that's a good thing for us in the long term.
Well, I've noticed in my own ones where they're little single plants, they are big, bushy, and happy. And then if you get in an area where they're a little more dense, they're usually smaller and don't quite.
Yeah. And they could be competing with each other. Maybe it's some of those effects that we were talking about with, maybe they're accumulating more soil pathogens that are eating their roots and preventing them from doing so well. Our black cherry, so black cherry in North America is an invasive species in Europe. So here it has lots of soil pathogens that when seeds are trying to germinate, if they're too close to other black cherries, there are more pathogens around them and they don't do as well. There, they do not have those pathogens and they kind of form these, all of the seeds do well and they're all next to each other. And so they become these dense stands. At least that's what research suggests. So it's possible that maybe with time that won't be the case. And you'll see some shifts in that. So it's not all negative, over time. Hopefully things will get better, but in the meantime, we've got to deal with managing them if we want to achieve our goals and have the woodlands that we want for our purposes, whether that's enjoying them or preserving biodiversity. So invasive species, they come in all different shapes and forms and sizes, from microscopic to huge areas of kudzu to giant Asian carp. So they come in all of these different forms. Let's talk about some of them. Examples. So invasive plants. You have invasive plants that are trees. So in this picture you have Tree of Heaven that I brought in kind of a ratty old sample of. But this is a more vibrant looking Tree of Heaven with maybe even some mimosa down here in the understory. I can't tell. Another invasive plant. You have Princess Tree of Paulownia, which has very large, big leaves. One that I'd like to highlight because I've seen a lot of it, both in landscapes and increasingly in old field sites, is Callery or Bradford pear. So how many of you are familiar with this species? Everyone.
Cleveland pear as well?
I'm not familiar with Cleveland pear. Is it a...
It looks like that when it flowers.
Okay.
So probably.
Is it a kind of non-fruiting pear that's popular? It's probably the same. Yeah. Well, Cleveland pear.
When you get a windstorm, you know it's a Bradford.
It is extremely popular in landscape trees. So it was just planted uniformly down the sides of streets. People like it because it looks beautiful in the spring. There's no getting around that. It does look lovely. It grows very rapidly. Of course, then it falls apart very rapidly, which has made it unpopular even among homeowners because it will drop leaves and damage everything around, fall apart. Also because it stinks. So when it is flowering, it smells pretty bad. So, and different people think it stinks more or less. Everybody generally agrees that it does not smell good, but it really bothers some people. But very popular ornamental, colonizes along roads and old field areas. So here's kind of in the spring, when it is flowering is when you will notice it, unless you're walking around. Because if you look from the highway, you will see all of these areas that look like they're just coming up in forests are filled with Callery or Bradford pear. So that's something to keep your eye out for in the spring, and you will suddenly see it, and you never realize just how abundant it was. It was initially thought to be sterile. And the version that was promoted was, oh, this will be fine, it won't become invasive. Of course, not all of them were that way. And it only took a few that weren't to create a huge problem. So.
You know about Doug Tolman?
Yes, well, so tell me what you know about Doug Tolman. What were you going to talk about?
Well, the fact that, say, an oak tree, it supports this huge population of caterpillars and things that birds need, and calorie pairs, because they do the co-evolve of birds. There are no caterpillars, and I have even read some stuff that in urban areas there are birds that are starving because there's not enough native trees with caterpillars on them to support the bird population.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, I was going to ask earlier, is it true as a collective that invasive species are sort of the junk food of the animal world? And like, I was told once that, what do you call it? Just passed it around, the
honeysuckle?
Like the berries offered no nutritional value to birds. I mean, is there any truth to that?
There are winners and there are losers in the bird world with bush honeysuckle. But the berries come at a time when most of our native species are not producing berries and are not necessarily aligned with the nutritional needs of our native birds during that time of year. Because a lot of them, what they really need are these insects that are feeding on our native trees. And Doug Tallamy has a lot of fantastic work on this. Another thing that Doug Tallamy said that really stuck with me, well, a couple things that relate to these species that we're talking about. First, that there are places where for him, it's not bad to have non-natives, but think of it as having a statue in your garden. It's okay to have some non-natives. They won't support the insects as much. Of course, when we talk about enemies, we're talking about insects and diseases. So there's pros and cons to having a tree that supports insects, right? Because it might be damaged by those insects. You might not like the way it looks, but they are, supporting insects, supporting birds that feed on those things. But it would look really silly if your entire yard was made of statues, right? Nobody wants that. That's not good. And so having an entire yard or an entire forest that is invasive or non-native species is kind of like having an entire yard that's full of statues. So promoting natives not as the only option, but as a foundation for supporting the ecosystems that depend on them in urban areas. However, I also heard another great speaker talk about how where he was working in very urban areas, I think he was in the New York area, many of these invasive species are the things that will succeed there and will tolerate those really stressful environments. And so if you want to get canopy cover in some of those areas, you're going to get tree of heaven and you're going to get other species like that. And that a tree grows in Brooklyn and that tree is tree of heaven. And so I think different people have different perspectives on that, but I certainly want to support the insects and birds and wildlife in urban areas as well. So I think that's an important point to draw with why not having invasives is a good thing. So here's some more ID of Bradford pear if you are not familiar with it. It has these hard fruits that soften over winter, but these smelly white flowers, shiny green leaves that are alternate. So let's move on to some shrubs, since that's a huge problem. So we already saw bush honeysuckle. There's also multiflora rose, autumn olive, many others. I am just touching on some examples. So if we're talking about trees, let's talk about shrubs. So bush honeysuckle. There are actually many different species of bush honeysuckle that are invasive. All of them, as far as I know, ornamentally used. People like them, they grow well, they have pretty flowers that smell nice, and if you were a kid you would suck the nectar out of them, or at least I did. Which is really weird having such positive childhood memories of an invasive species. Yeah. Bush doesn't smell that I know of. Japanese honeysuckle smells lovely. Yeah, yeah. But it is maybe, I've heard from many people say that it is way worse to manage than bush honeysuckle because it is hard with bush honeysuckle. You can cut it and then treat the stump with an herbicide. With Japanese honeysuckle, it is a vine that kind of covers everything, and it's really hard to get all of that or to treat that in the same way. In the same family, we also have a native honeysuckle, so it's a little tricky because there's native honeysuckles and invasive. But generally, when you see honeysuckle, you are seeing either Japanese honeysuckle, which is the vine, or bush honeysuckle, which is a bush. So in its different phases, it is one of the earliest